and also for having me at your seminar and workshop series. I want to talk about a project on diversity across scientific disciplines. I'm the co-editor of the special issue of a journal on that, and I have taken over the part that deals with biodiversity, especially how the notion of biodiversity developed and the function or role it plays. And I would like to start talking about this beautiful picture that I put on the title slide. Some of you might have seen it before. That's the Hall of Biodiversity at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. If you visit the city, that might be some of the spots that you go to, and some of you might have actually encountered it before. What's interesting about it is this is probably how we imagine biodiversity. It's a wealth of different species and life forms. They display 1,500 specimens there. And the interesting thing about it, what struck me is, that's arranged in a slightly old-fashioned way. So the species specimens are here arranged in a way that heightens contrast between them. So you have small animals next to very big ones. You have colors that are juxtaposing each other's, all to heighten a certain sense of diversity, which is what this is about. It was created in 1998 in order to educate the public about the value of biodiversity. In this way of heightening this kind of uniqueness and diversity of different life form, it really reminds of an older form of museum displays that is very much decoupled from the way that museum work is done at natural history museums today, including the American Museum. It really is reminiscent of the Cabinet of Curiosities of the early modern age. And here you have the most famous picture. I'm sure many of you have seen that before as well, of Ole Worm's Cabinet of Curiosities. Maybe the excuse I have to use a picture that has been used so many times before is that Ole Worms was born in Aarhus, where I'm sitting right now in my office. So that might fit. What he did here, what you see in this frontispiece of his catalog is he also juxtaposed very different forms to heighten uniqueness. He was not building a series as you would do if you're informed by evolutionary theory, but really to create a sense of wonder. Or curiosity, that being the name of these cabinets as well. So the question is, why on earth, in communicating its work to the public, does the Museum of Natural History in New York take an approach that dates from the 16th and 17th century? Don't they have anything more up to date? And the argument I want to make by making this connection between the old cabinets and curiosities and the Hall of Biodiversity is that biodiversity is not first and foremost a scientific concept guiding scientific research, but it's mostly a tool for science communication. At that part of the science of biology that has a resonance with the public at large, and that scientists can use as a catchphrase in public campaigning. And you can actually notice that although the idea, the marveling at diversity is very old and can already be found in the 16th and 17th century, also under the name of diversity, the word biodiversity is actually very recent. It was only coined in the mid-1980s. Even the longer expression biological diversity was not really in use before. It did not have a specific meaning if it showed up. I was a little bit lazy here and took a Google Ngram. People have used other ways to trace the use of this word before with the very same result, showing that it had a steep rise in the mid-1980s, and then it reached a plateau around the year 2000 and went into slight decline. What I want to do in my talk today is talk about this life cycle of this phrase and its meaning, and why it was so popular, and also why it eventually went into decline again. So what does biodiversity mean? Well, it's not that easy to pin down. The definition is a little bit fuzzy. Most often, if people want to be concise, they refer to the Convention on Biological Diversity of 1992 that was drafted and signed at the Rio Earth Summit in the early 90s. And Article 2 is a central part, which makes clear that biodiversity refers to diversity at different levels: the species level, the genomic level, and the ecosystem level. And this kind of encompassing nature of valuing diversity at 3 different levels is kind of the trademark of this notion of biodiversity. Beyond that, it's not very clear how you should measure diversity, why it is valued, and how exactly it should be applied in conservation. And actually, surprisingly, scientists, conservation biologists are very outspoken about this. I have a quote here from a textbook published in 2002, still in print in later editions. I've had certain tendency to always pick very long quotes. The last sentence is the important one. So where he says, this is simply, biodiversity is simply short, diversity and richness is short for biological diversity and has no strict scientific definition. So you wonder, such a word that is so important and so frequently used, why do scientists who use it say it has no strict definition? And what I want to argue is that it's actually a perfect example for what Starr and Grisema have called a boundary object. So by introducing the notion of boundary object, I won't tell you anything new. That's an article that has close, the one that is referenced here has close to 15,000 references, I think. What I basically want to do is to apply it and talk about the life cycle. So what Starr and Grisema point out, a boundary object is defined by the fact that it's ambiguous, it's not standardized or clearly defined, and it has a purpose to draw different groups of people together. It enables cooperation without consensus, or in this case, without a clear definition. If this boundary object is more clearly defined or standardized, then that happens at a level of one of the specific groups working with it, but not of the general or shared use. Between groups, it remains ambiguous, and this makes for its success, because different constituencies or different groups of people can give it their very own meaning. So far, we know that that is the meaning or the catch of a boundary object. Now, it's a bit unhappy to choose this notion for biodiversity since it's a word or a concept and not an object. The initial appeal of the article was also that it talked about material objects like maps and things like that. But later, Susan Starr, who came up with the idea, conceded that it can be applied to almost everything. It can also be applied to words or concept. According to her, that is fine, as long as one keeps in mind the way that it's used or organized, that it floats between, circulates in use between different groups as a defining feature. What he also said in this later reflection that I reference here is the actually interesting part, not really fleshed out, basically only hinted at with her own graph, namely that boundary objects also have a life cycle. She suggests that there's an initial period of coming into being, drawing different groups together. Then it might eventually become standardized by one specific group or a dominant group, which means that some of the other meanings are cut out again. That creates some outsiders or miscellaneous categories, which might then be used by other groups again, which gives rise to new boundary objects. So she talks about the life and death of boundary objects. And I want to look at biodiversity following this cycle of coming to life and maybe being closer to old age or even death again. So for that purpose, I visited archives in Washington, D.C., in this case, a Smithsonian institution, which had the relevant files for tracing the coinage of the notion of biodiversity. And in accounting for it, why somebody coined it in the first place, in 1985 that was, we have to understand the context. Although it is a globally known idea or concept, especially through the Convention of Biological Diversity, the reason why it was created was of rather a local or national nature. It had to do with the election of Ronald Reagan as president of the United States, elected in the late year 1980 and coming into office at the beginning of 1981. So we all know that as an event of the rise of neoliberalism, one of its most clear-cut forms, and we also know that Reagan was not a particular friend of environmental policies, since they interfered with the free market, and he tried to cut them as well as he could right after coming into office. He had a law that specified that a regulation that every new law has to be screened for a cost-benefit analysis, and he was also very keen on cutting down on the Endangered Species Act in the United States, that at that moment was a major instrument of being in place of what we now call biodiversity. So the conservation community, environmentalists, were in alarm. And quite specifically, the one program that was hit the worst was the so-called Man and the Biosphere program, especially the US party to that section. Man and the Biosphere is run by UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, with its headquarters in Paris, of which the United States was a very important member state at that point in time. I think giving more than 50% of the finance to UNESCO. And Ronald Reagan administration decided at the end of 1983 to actually leave UNESCO, which means that all UNESCO-funded organizations or programs in the United States would no longer have funding. So initially, the American money for UNESCO came from the State Department. It went to Paris and was reallocated to UNESCO programs in the United States. And with news being there that the United States would leave UNESCO, these programs had no funding anymore. And we don't have to search too far to understand what scientists do when they run out of funding. They try to look for new ways to fund their research. So the people behind the US Man and the Biosphere program got together in late 1984. Had a planning meeting, found out if we don't find a new source of funding by the end of the year, we will be out of business. Then our program is over. So they said, we have worked well so far. We don't have a scientific problem here. Our science is sound. It has relevance for conservation policies. It's just this funding issue that's a problem. So they asked the question, what problems for US agencies who have money can we solve? And the Man and the Biosphere program, MAB, was supposed to bring together scientists and decision makers and users. So now we have to build a new symbolism and use it, that we can use to sell our work that we have been doing before. And this actually, in the end, was the notion of biodiversity. This concept was a new symbolism that they used to sell their research projects. So what research have they been doing before? So this was basically the prehistory the notion of biodiversity. And it came by a slightly different name. It contained the phrase diversity, but it was tied to a specific ecological theory that is known as a diversity stability hypothesis. So here's a very cumbersome quote from a textbook by Eugene Odum from the 1950s, American ecologist whose father was actually a sociologist, Howard Odum. This is only one of the versions of it. The entire idea behind it was already developed by the early ecologists like Charles Elton in the 1920s and 30s. It was known in Britain as well, not just in the US, but one can say that by the 50s and 60s, this was an established theory that every ecologist has heard about, and it was one of the major rationales for nature conservation at the time. The idea was that a stable ecosystem, a more diverse ecosystem will be more stable than one that has lesser species diversity. Here shows in a picture of a food web. That's not a perfect representation of this hypothesis, but there was no real image for diversity stability hypothesis. But that's basically the idea behind it. So why did that matter? It had a bit of an economic rationale. The idea was we look at nature as providing food or resources for human being. We want that to be crisis-proof and take place on a persistent basis. We want to be able to count on it and be able to rationally plan it. And diversity plays a role here since it produces this kind of stability in ecosystems. A prominent contrast was to juxtapose the rainforest with a monoculture created by human beings and show that the one is very resilient when it comes to environmental changes and the other one, or environmental interventions, and the other one is not. So this is something that that conservationists use to sell the importance of their work, and research on ecosystem stability and in relation to diversity was exactly what the Man on the Biosphere program was doing. It was created to fund research on ecosystem stability. So now, in the US, I had the problem that the funding for this research wasn't there anymore. They wanted to continue, but the money was gone. So two US government agencies got together. The National Academy of Sciences and the Smithsonian Institution. They decided to host an event in 1986. It took place. In the end, it was called the National Forum on Biodiversity. And this is the first real public appearance of the word biodiversity. The entire purpose of this event was to get this message or this new concept out. It was created, the notion of biodiversity, by Walter Rosen, one of the program officers of the National Academy of Sciences, who was in charge with his counterpart from the Smithsonian Institution to organize this event. And what they did is they invited rank and file scientists, biologists, conservationists to speak about the state of nature in the world's diversity, natural diversity, and bring the message home that this is critically endangered and that biodiversity is important. Now, a lot of the contributions here at the end, the conference proceedings were published at the book where I took the picture from by Edward O. Wilson, a very prominent naturalist, maybe one of the most prominent in the second half of the 20th century, who recently passed away. Wilson himself was not so keen of this notion of biodiversity. When it was suggested to him, he first didn't want it. He said it lacks dignity, it's too catchy. But he later gave in. It was so successful in the end, as planned, actually, that he turned into one of the major promoters of this notion. He also wrote a subsequent book, The Diversity of Life, that greatly helped to promote it. But although he was probably the best-known scientist involved, he was not the one who came up with this notion, with this catchphrase of biodiversity. It was really more the conference organizer who did it. And the word was slowly emerging. I traced it through the documents that are at the archive at the Smithsonian. And it first was called biological diversity, then biotic diversity, and then he had the inspiration to make one word out of it, just call it biodiversity. And actually, head of the Smithsonian Institution had written him a letter and said, well, biotic diversity is a word, at that point he was using that maybe scientists like, but it's too technical, not catchy enough. Come up with something more catchy. And you should talk with our public affairs officer, Madeleine Jacobs. So I couldn't figure out if the public affairs officer, who's basically engaged in marketing or public outreach, actually had her hands into suggesting the word biodiversity. Right now, Walter Rosen gets the credit for it, but it is clear that the word was coined to be catchy and to be that it can be used to communicating nature conservation and its importance and research on topics that are relevant to nature conservation to the public. So here's a quote from the public affairs officer saying that the goal was not to have an academic conference, but the goal was to get real public attention to that. And they succeeded. And that's basically what the Google Ngram showed. It was a small event in Washington, D.C., a couple of scientists creating a new word and a new idea, and then pushing or getting the message out. And it really spread. It's amazing how successful they were. Actually. So what was the strategy? So they were no longer talking about the diversity stability hypothesis, or at least it wasn't at the center anymore. The focus was also no longer exclusively on the economic importance of conservation. But instead, they coupled the full range of reasons that you can have to make an argument for nature conservation. You can also make ethical arguments that nature has an intrinsic value, that human beings don't have a right to destroy it. You can make an aesthetic argument that it is good for human enjoyment, independent of whether it pays off as a resource, but it also has recreational purpose. And they basically decided, since they can no longer rely on the State Department to give them money, they need a lot of smaller audiences they can pitch their message to. So they have to tailor-make their message when they choose a different audience. So in the planning of the event, they outlined 5 audiences they want to talk to: the general public, news media, public policymakers, developers, industrialists or the economy, and educators, including school teachers and people like that. So, and they would write different prospectuses or different pitch letters to each of these audiences, highlighting the arguments or reasons why biodiversity matters that would resonate with this particular audience. They were also thinking about contacting the church, and they certainly would not put an economic argument in the foreground there. So that was the idea behind it. And the beauty of the notion of biodiversity is exactly what I showed in the textbook quote at the beginning, that it has no strict scientific definition. It's this kind of ambiguous boundary object that Starr and Grisema talked about. A word that people can agree on, that they want to work with it, and they can agree that it is important, but then every subgroup or every different group working with it gives it a different, more precise meaning. And the overall meaning remains ambiguous. And one presenter at the National Forum of Biodiversity saying that afterwards, giving this very assessment in those very words was David Ehrenfeld. He said, I don't have a definition of biodiversity. It's one of those wonderful catchwords that, because it's vaguely defined, has a broad appeal like motherhood. Could have added apple pie as well. And this is precisely how it works. And he didn't want to be critical or cynical. He actually is a professor of biology or even conservation biology at Rutgers University, now emeritus, I think. And he is known for writing what is by some considered the first textbook of conservation biology to be published in the US. This was in 1970. Then he also wrote a more publicly accessible version of it 2 years later. And he already formulated an intriguing insight there. He observed that American conservationists cannot agree among themselves why conservation matters. In the US, you have the split between conservation and preservation. They even use two different words. Preservation is preserving wilderness in its original integrity. It considers nature to be of intrinsic value. And then you have conservation, which is basically about harnessing nature as a resource for human consumption, and a purely instrumental argument. And then conservationists always get in fights with each other, which of these arguments should prevail and how it should be carried out in practice. And he observed in the early 70s that conservationists should stop fighting with each other. Instead of putting a specific rationale for conservation in the foreground, they should focus on their common denominator, which is the idea of diversity. They should just say diversity matters and is important, and leave it to the different conservationists to decide why diversity matters. And this is exactly what happened later when the notion of biodiversity was coined. They basically followed this initial advice that was already around more than a decade before. So it wasn't David Ehrenfeld who coined it. He was present at the event. Maybe he gave some advice, but he was not the one who created it, although he had the very same idea. He was the first editor of the journal Conservation Biology, though, that was created at the same time, I think in 1985 or 86. That was the time the Society for Conservation Biology was founded in the United States, growing out of an international event, and also with some of the people who were involved in the National Forum on Biodiversity being central to setting up this society. What it basically did is establishing conservation biology as an independent or autonomous academic subfield or subdiscipline. So it was then competing with wildlife management, which you can study at university or in specific programs, and you could work for government agencies. But according to the people behind the Society for Conservation Biology, the scope of this government agency was not broad enough. One of the criticism was that it is just about ducks and deer, basically game animals that a lot of people care about, but they don't care about more remote species that are better addressed with the notion of biodiversity. So actually, the notion of biodiversity became the defining concept of conservation biology. Michael Soule, who was the leading figure in creating the Society for Conservation Biology, wrote something like its pamphlet or its manifesto, where he specifically said conservation biology is about biodiversity, and we start by the idea that biodiversity is something good and important to be preserved, without specifically defining what biodiversity means. And this society was a tremendous success. It's flourishing until today. It's a major organization in its field, and its journal is basically also the flagship journal of conservation biology. Now, how did the story continue? This was a success part. There's a little bit more success. The next step was, well, I said this was initially only a local matter of getting one research project in the US, a new source of funding, and then it morphed into something bigger. It actually came back to UNESCO and the Man and the Biosphere program. So at first, as the Smithsonian, there was a research center set up on biodiversity that became one of the branches of the American Man and the Biosphere program. And then after the Convention of Biological Diversity went into force, the entire UNESCO Man and the Biospheres program was restructured, not only for the United States, but for every member state. So initially they had 14 different research projects or project areas where they do research on ecosystems. And afterwards, it was less research focused and more mission driven. It had 5 priorities of what it is supposed to achieve. And well, I will only read the top priority here: conserving biodiversity and ecological processes. So suddenly all of Man and the Biosphere program was about biodiversity. And the diversity stability hypothesis was no longer in the foreground. So this is not necessarily something that conservationists highlight when they make an argument for the importance of conservation. It's a thing that really faded away once biodiversity was out there, the notion of biodiversity. That doesn't mean that it was now strictly or clearly defined. Actually, the ambiguity persisted, even at the level of UNESCO, even when deciding that it is a top priority for this program to do work on biodiversity. They quite bluntly, in a discussion or in a report, conceded that, well, it's worth reading. The Convention on Biological Diversity was signed in Rio without most people knowing what is meant by biological diversity. There are many uncertainties surrounding biodiversity. Key scientific questions are in need of answer. Do we need all those species for the functioning of the biosphere? What is the role of biodiversity in ecosystem functioning and therefore sustainability? So it wasn't clear at all. Everybody agreed this is important. We should do something about biodiversity. But beneath this superficial agreement, it still had to be broken down in something more specific. And interestingly enough, if one looks at textbooks or handbooks in conservation biology, they all say so, that is the case. Like the one I quoted already, which said biodiversity has no strict scientific definition. A lot of them start like that. Initially, when the first textbook started using this notion, it sometimes was formulated almost like some alarm. Here's one textbook from 1997. That almost turned critical in pointing that out. They said to protect biodiversity, we need to act. In order to act, in order to answer the question, if we want to protect biodiversity, what should we do? We must have a concept of biodiversity that can guide our actions. A definition of biodiversity is equivalent to life on Earth, or all genes, species, and ecosystems is of no help at all. And here the phrase all genes, species, and ecosystems is precisely what Article 2 of the Convention on Biological Diversity is about. This is a catch-all definition that it's biodiversity is the diversity of everything. And they point out, well, with this notion, we don't know what research to do, and we don't know what to prioritize in conservation action. If we actually want to do something, either as scientists or as conservationists, we have to become more specific. And this is actually what a lot of textbooks agree on. By now, in the 2000s, they would point it in a less critical and alarmist way, more into affirmative saying that one can conceive of biodiversity in different ways. One can measure it differently with different indices. One can look at structural or functional diversity of ecosystems or species. And depending on what one puts in the foreground, one has to conceptualize biodiversity slightly differently. And it's also a matter of values. It always depends on what one values and for what purpose one wants to conserve biodiversity. And then usually lots of these handbooks have a chapter on conservation ethics. So basically then they also point out the contrast between conservation and preservation. At least in the US case, if it is an American textbook that I have already mentioned. So it's not trying to gloss that over, but it's pointing out quite elaborately, actually, biodiversity is an empty catchphrase. The real work that has to be done lies behind that concept. And that gets me already to the last aspect, and I'm noting that I'm way too fast, which is this article on review article on biodiversity and ecosystem functioning that a large group, expert group of ecologists wrote in 2005. The idea was we pool all our knowledge we have on what we know about ecosystem in relation to diversity and write something like a meta-analysis. And they basically decide early on in this text that they don't want to work with the notion of biodiversity. It's a long quote, so I highlighted the part that matters in red. Here they say, we are explicit in our use of terminology in this paper. If we sometimes we use species richness if we talk about diversity of species, diversity when discussing other attributes, and biodiversity only at the most general level. So this is an effort is disaggregation where the actual scientific research is not relying on the word biodiversity anymore at all. It is broken down in more specific technical terms, depending on what aspect stands in the foreground. So you still might find the word biodiversity on the cover on the conservation biology textbook, but this is almost where it ends. In the book, you will find the more specialized meanings, disaggregated meanings of the different things biodiversity can mean. And this is what scientists then work with. And this is also what I think is the reason for the decline in the use of the notion of biodiversity. So Google Ngram can't show that. So I also looked at the journal Conservation Biology, but published by the Society for Conservation Biology. And there also was a recent decline in the use of the notion of biodiversity. Again, it's a core concept. They should be all about that. And even there is a slight decline in the last 2 or 3 years. So it's a little bit too early to talk of a trend. It can also be a fluctuation, and it might come back or might continue to rise. But it is at least possible that even within this expert community, the word will get slightly less fashionable. So this is precisely the life cycle of a boundary object that Susan Leigh Starr hinted at her later review article of how the concept has been used and developed since they initially created it in the late 80s. That this is one thing that might exist and that one might want to study more. And at the same time, I should add, although Leigh Starr calls it the life and death of boundary objects, I think one shouldn't call it the death. Biodiversity is still flourishing. It just experiences a decline. I don't think that it will go away. It's just losing some of its significance. And at the same time, the institutions that are built around it are very, very successful. So the Convention on Biological Diversity still exists. Member states to the convention have national action plans like the UK, and institutions and programs on conservation biology are also well established, and one could say they have replaced wildlife management, which preceded them. So this is a success story, not a fading out of existing, but it still shows that once this institution building was done, and once it succeeded, the initial ambiguous boundary object became less important. This ambiguity was only needed at the moment where it was necessary to create a large constituency for a project, to draw diverse groups of people who had different interests and different values together. And after the institution building was done, it wasn't necessarily necessary anymore to focus on this boundary object, and one could well do one's work in a different way. Yes, so I finished way too early. Apologies for that, but this is basically the story I wanted to tell. I hope it doesn't sound too critical. I'm actually a big fan of biodiversity conservation, and I got into this more small-scale tracing of one word after working on the development of bird conservation in Britain and Germany in the 19th and 20th century, the book that Paola already mentioned. And of course, it has a long history, even before the word biodiversity was used. And I was very happy that I had the chance to interview a lot of very passionate conservationists in doing my work. And I have a lot of admiration for the work they do. But since they themselves are ready to admit that they use some cunning tricks once in a while to get their way, one can also write about that, I think. It doesn't diminish the value of their work if one acknowledges that that is what they are doing. Thanks.